Three of you in different ways kind of alluded to links to memory. Memory versus anticipation, memory and anticipation. But it was, there was sort of a mention, yes, is probably relevant, but not much more than that. And partly for selfish reasons, and partly because I think many people who don't study intervals think of time, it's sort of in the broader, more philosophical sense, as relevant to passage of time, memory, how we think about the past, how we plan for the future. I'd love to hear your thoughts, maybe a little bit more on that topic.
I think there's increasing evidence that that experience in memory is organized by time and place of occurrence. And so one of the things we've known now for a long time, that there are neurons in the hippocampus that signal where the animal is in a familiar environment. So one neuron will fire when the animal's here on the table, and a different one will fire when the animal's here on the table, and so on. So we know that they're signaling where the animal is in space, but Eichenbaum and others have recently shown that those same neurons are signaling where the animal is in time. So that if you have a task in which, similar to the ones that Mike was sketching, and similar to all the temporal discounting tasks, they all involve delays of some kind. So you get some input in the Eichenbaum experiments, you get an odor at one moment, and the choice you're going to make 20 seconds down the road depends upon the odor that you've gotten. And what you see is that different neurons in the hippocampus signal how far you are through that 20-second interval. So here the animal's directly drawing on memory, and it appears that the signaling both the time and the place are essential to that entire function. And to me, that helps solve a puzzle that I think most psychologists, neuropsychologists must have puzzled about at one time or another. There's a huge body of data in human neuropsychology involving lesions of the hippocampus that show that these lesions are devastating for memory in general. The famous patient HM is a case in point in which his hippocampus was bilaterally removed and basically never learned anything subsequently. And in advanced alcoholism, there's often deterioration of the hippocampus. Anyway, there's a tremendous amount of evidence that the hippocampus plays some fundamental role in the ability to remember, full stop. Then on the other hand, we have all this evidence that, well, the hippocampus seems to be where the cognitive map lies, where all this evidence from single unit studies that in which it seems to be concerned about where the animal is. So how do you put those two bodies of fact together? Well, if location in both time and space are fundamental to memory retrieval, then you can see why the hippocampus might have both of these effects.
So I very much agree that memory is absolutely critical for all decision making that occurs, and certainly that we economists study. The way I think about it is, we have a set of experiences. We remember those experiences imperfectly, and through that set of experiences and memories, we develop a representation of the world. And it is that representation of the world that we're going to use to do all of this forward-looking planning. So in the way I think about it, the past ends up being a model for the future, and the past ends up being consequently the foundation on which we do all of this forward-looking planning, which explains, in the way I see it, why children are so spectacularly impatient, because they have such a limited data set of past events. So children don't have this enormous data set and this enormous scaffold of memories on which to build a good model of the future. And if you don't have a model of the future, well, no wonder you're living in the present, because you don't know what to prepare for or invest in or care about that's coming 5 or 10 years later. So what you do know about is where the cookies are. That you figured out. You don't know how reading a book might contribute to satisfaction later in life, because you've never had that mapping from an experience in school to a success decades later related to some literary insight you had that paid off half a lifetime later in your experiences. So no wonder children are so focused on the present. It's their lack of a past that is driving that, and their lack of a kind of complete model or a more complete model of the world that prevents them from thinking so much about the future. And likewise, no wonder a 60-year-old who is closer to the end of their life, surely, than that child, actually cares more about the future, because they have a good theory of the future scaffolded on all of those memories and all of those life experiences that enable them to build a richer and more correct theory of what is coming in the next decade. So I think memory is the foundation on which we build our representation of the world, memory, learning, experience, that enables us to act patiently in the first place.
I'm just going to add to that. I don't know if everyone here knows, just to put those 2 points together, right? There's been a lot of research in the last several years showing that the ability to think about something happening in the future, what people often refer to as prospection, imagining your birthday 3 years from now, in terms of the recruitment or kind of metabolism in the brain, looks very similar to what happens when you're remembering your birthday 5 years ago. And a lot of that is happening in the hippocampus. So I think that just really kind of suggests not only that there's neuroscience evidence for parallel processes in imagining and retrieving, but that they're centered on the hippocampus.
It's not obvious to me that the time that we experience is the time that we remember. And I wonder if there's, I just don't know enough about memory research. I'd just like to throw this question at you, perhaps, that is when we remember things, it seems in some sense that process itself is a decision that we might want to retrieve it at some point. And I wonder whether there's any evidence that part of what we do when we establish the conditions of retrieval, which is a fancy way of saying learn, is to also establish the horizon over which we think we might want to retrieve. And that comes back to David's idea about the kids versus the 60-year-old, but also might dissociate the notion of time as experience from time remembered.
Yeah, because it's an interesting, the idea, if I'm understanding correctly, you're asking is to what extent does prediction of, sort of some prediction of when we will need to retrieve a memory, is that encoded in the memory itself? I don't know if Peter knows, at least in humans, the only examples I can think of are these sort of regular intervals, which is very different from, I think, the kinds of memories you're asking about. And in fact, my view of this issue of time in memory in humans is that there are really distinctions between remembering when something happened in terms of intervals versus remembering sort of a timestamp as a context, right? Another thing that really I think is hinted at in all three talks, but not really discussed, is this question of, often time is a context. We know approximately when something happened. I was thinking about that with the animals early on. It's not necessarily a clock, or doesn't have to be. There's a lot of temporal information in our environment that can be bound together a lot with everything else that's happening.
But we know in the case of the food anticipation it is, because if you shift the clock, you shift when.
Right.
I mean, we actually, it's one of the things that's happened in my lifetime. When I was a graduate student, we knew nothing about the neurobiology of the circadian clock, and now we know a lot. And so we know, that's why I began by talking about these biochemical cycles, because we know it is a biochemical cycle. We know the neurons that are crucial to it. And we know how to shift that clock. Every computer has a clock. That's why when you store a file, it records the time at which you close the file. And that clock resides on the computer. And if you go in and hack the clock, you can change the computer's sense of time. Well, we know how to hack the brain's clock. There are several ways to do it, but some general anesthesias shift the clock. They set it off by several hours. And so you can directly demonstrate that the behavior is, because if you do that, if you shift the clock, you shift the times at which those behaviors, the anticipatory behaviors, occur. Well, that's pretty powerful evidence that that's the basis for these circadian ones. The duration, we haven't made the same progress with the duration that we've made with points in time.
Yeah, I'm just nonetheless, when we experience memories, many cases we think, if someone asks you, when did that happen? And you retrieve a very clear memory and you say, oh wait, I know that when he said that I was having breakfast, it must have been in the morning.
Yeah.
Right, so there's sort of the temporal information embedded in a lot of other details.
For sure. I mean, certainly we all, I think, engage
addition,
in,
right.
well, let's see, it happened before X, and I know when X happened, yeah.
Yes.
I have a question regarding how memory in the brain works with dementia.
Let me just repeat the question.
How memory and the brain work with dementia.
In time.
Yeah, well, you were looking at me, and I know very little about dementia. And I wouldn't want to say.
Anyone?
I think it's, for the most part, less explored than it ought to be. I think from my point of view, speaking now more as a neurologist than a neuroscientist, it's something that might give us some insight into early forms of dementia, and to go to again to what David was saying, that the ability to hook ideas, to hook memories onto possible, I'll put this into my own provisional affordance notion, to be able to kind of think about the way that in the future I might want to report to another about an event. Okay, it's a lot of words to say, remember, that kind of a process may be one of the things that goes wrong in early dementia. At some point things most people believe that what goes wrong is the ability to actually do the retrieval itself. But one has to wonder whether some of the things that go wrong in dementia have to do with the encoding part itself.
I guess I do know one thing, and Mike will correct me if I'm wrong, because Mike is actually a neurologist. This is about the only thing I think I know is that a neurologist, when interviewing a patient suspected of dementia, often begins by asking them questions to determine how well localized they are in space and time, right? What the year is, what the week is, what the month is, where they are, at home or in the hospital, and so on. And I think that's because, and you correct me if I've got this wrong, that if they're badly localized and if they really don't know where they are in space and time, then the dementia has progressed quite far and they've got very serious problem. Am I right about what neurologists do? Or?
A little bit.
Yeah, I have a question. Initially, for Randy, it would be interesting to hear comments from Mike too. There seems to be a distinction between being sensitive to time and actually representing it as time. So, a very primitive creature may be sensitive to a chemical gradient, may steer by a chemical gradient, but doesn't mean it's representing it as a chemical gradient. So we always need to respect that distinction between being sensitive to some variable, actually representing it as the kind of variable it is. So something more is required rather than sensitivity to representation. Would you like to comment on what more it should be, or?
It was exactly for that question that I began with those B data. Because in fact that issue has loomed large in that literature. There's a whole school of thought that has argued that the bee's brain isn't actually representing the time of day. that biochemical processes that vary as a function of the time of day determine whether the bee has access to that memory or not, right? What those data show is that that bee has access to the memory of the feeding at both stations at all times of day. Because, and it makes varying use of that, right? That was, because, so remember what happens is that the bee goes to the morning table at the expected time. First of all, it goes in anticipation of the expected time, not during the time when he's actually got fed, but the peak in arrival is actually shortly before the onset of the feeding. And if there's nothing there, they go to the other table, but they don't typically land and actually go in. Why? Well, because it's unlikely that at this time of day there's anything available at that other table. So I think that's a fairly strong argument that the time of day is actually represented, that it's not controlling access to the memory.
So it shows that it's sensitivity to phase time, but not to particular times, as somebody might say. Sensitive to what stage you've reached in a certain process or a certain phase, but there's many different days when that same particular phase is reached, but they're different times. So if you're representing a particular time, I mean, that's something that would be part of what's involved in representing time, I think.
Well, that's, so that, I began with that circle, because if you think about it for a while, you think, well, wait a second. Once you've gone all the way around the circle, it's just a repetition, right? So if you've only got one circle, if you've only got circadian time, then you can't distinguish the events of one day from the events of another day. We know that the brain has many circles. It has processes that cycle in one day, processes that cycle in a couple of hours, processes that cycle on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, on a yearly basis, and even, I think, didn't we have the 17-year locus emerge here? And we know that they're all internally controlled. So your question really hinges on how many different phase points enter into the animal's record of the time of occurrence, which is exactly the same question in human written recording of time, right? When you may just write down the time of day at which something happens, in which case you won't be sure about the day at which it happens, or you may write down the time of day and the day, right, the weekly cycle, or you may even be so clever as to write down the day of the month, and maybe even the year, and so on. So there's a kind, in the brain you see the same mathematical logic for the recording of time that you see in conventional human recording of time. Namely, the reach of the record depends upon the period of the largest cycle for which you record the phase.
Can I follow up? Why is it in the bee example time and not a cue-driven behavior?
Because of the clock shift. That is, we know that you can shift, you can get that same bee, I'm synthesizing various experiments here. Okay, so the exact experiment hasn't been done, but so we know.
Well, right, experiment could be done, yeah.
And I think if you piece together what has been done, you'll see that, in essence, this experiment. So let's use a general anesthesia now, right, to 6-hour clock shift the clock of this bee, right? So now they will shift when they arrive at those tables, and the cues are now going to be completely different, right?
Yeah. Right.
So that's powerful evidence that it's being driven by.
But that evidence would apply to the animal models that have received the anesthesia experiment. I mean, the open question with bees is, whether they're using an internal clock, which would be affected
Oh,
by
but in anesthesia, clock shifts the beat.
I see. I see. That has been done.
Oh, indeed, I'm a co-author on a version of this experiment, though not with the anticipated. The bees, I originally had this in my talk, but I thought it would go much too long. The bees use the sun to navigate by, which anybody who does backcountry hiking would think is pretty astonishing because the sun moves, right? And it moves in the ways that depend on which hemisphere you're in and the season and so on. So how can they possibly do that? They use it as a sun compass. They do it because they learn the solar ephemeris. They learn where the compass direction of the sun as a function of the time of day at the place where they now are, and so on. And one of the ways in which we know this is if you clock shift the bees in their navigation, they go off on the wrong, it's like putting a piece of iron next to the compass. They go off in the wrong direction. And in collaboration with others, an anesthesiologist who discovered the fact that you could clock shift with general anesthesia, we did that navigation experiment and showed that anesthetically produced clock shift produced the predicted error in the navigation.
I was wondering if the panelists could speak to how visualization and even more so how imaging changes the utility function, the strength of memory retrieval, anticipation rate. I think that's a very relevant thing as it pertains to time and what the effect of whatever is happening in that event. It's very practical too. I think all of us here do visualize and do image. How does that relate to this what we heard today?
So in economics, there's not a lot of work exploring that direction, but there is some that is in adjacent fields. One team has shown subjects aged images of themselves. So they're now staring at their 65-year-old self, though they're now 20, and they're asked, what savings rate would you like to pick for yourself? And at least when choosing hypothetical savings rates, that manipulation has increased chosen savings rates. To my knowledge, that has not yet been done in the field with actual savings rates. I'm eager to see that work extended, but I do think it's reasonable to think that if you help people better appreciate a future state, make it more concrete, make it easier to predict, reduce the noise, people will be more responsive to that future state, in this case being 65 years old. But there isn't actually, there's less work than I would have liked, given how natural it seems to us that if you can just visualize these later states, maybe you'll be more responsive to them. I think that's a good hypothesis, one in need of more work.
Could I just jump in? There is one study in sort of cognitive neuroscience, human brain imaging, that took a temporal discounting task and asked people, would you want, $1 now, $3 later, then added a condition where sometimes the $3 later you were asked to imagine in a concrete context, right? So just like I said before, imagine your birthday 5 years ago, your birthday in 5 years. So it attached it to a specific episode and showed that people were more patient in their choices in the condition where they were asked to imagine a concrete event. And one of the most interesting things I think about that study is not just the choices, but that increased patience was associated with brain activity in human functional imaging in the hippocampus. Again, this part of the brain that we know is memory, essential for memory, and that there's now increasing evidence that is also important for prospecting, imagining the future.
Yeah. A related finding that you reminded me of, it's not quite visualization, but it may be. When you ask people, would you like money now or money in 3 months? You get a certain degree of impatience. When you ask randomly chosen subjects a slightly different version of that question, would you like money now or would you like the money on May 23rd, 2016? You get less impatience. So once again, making it concrete seems to reduce the degree of impatience, supporting the general theme that's emerging here.
Well, you were asking also about feedback, right? And so in the, I mean, I think a fun example is in music. If, you know, all the timing that I showed you was self-timing. And if we relied on that to play music together, I don't know if you were a musician, we would not tolerate each other because we have this, our timing capacity has an uncertainty that scales with the amount of time. And even at the level of a relatively speedy or slow, any relative beats or measures in music, we would all be splayed all over the place. It would be even worse than your clapping in that experiment, okay? So the first one's almost as good as you were when you got some practice. But nonetheless, what happens when people are together in ensemble is that they get extremely precise. They completely beat this scalar variability of timing, okay? Now, does that occur because of feedback? No, not really. I think it occurs because of more of a theory of mind, in a sense, of what the others are going to do and an anticipation. And this was a lot of, I think, unexplored neuroscience there, but also unexplored psychology. But it's pretty amazing how well we do. And it just could be that what I'm trying to do for you is maybe translate the word feedback, as is often done in neuroscience, to something that sounds a bit more predictive. In this case, predictive of what the person, you know, hitting the bass is about to place the pulse.
Thank you very much.
Question from this side. Go ahead.
So I think I'm struggling to actually relate all of these things. I think it relates to the distinction that you said. There seems to be a difference between timing and time. And whether it's a circadian rhythm, the parallel fibers across the Purkinje cells, or the larger planning for your retirement. So it might be tempting to think of the brain as having all these little clocks, or gears, like a fancy sort of clock in a church. But is it sort of a red herring? Is there really a relationship between timing and time? And musicians are always...
So your question kind of assumes that we have a theory of time independent of timing. And if we do, I don't know what that theory is. That is, there's an old, in philosophy, you know, what is time, right? I've always thought, that way lies madness. There's never, I'm not going to try to say what time is, but I can say how you can measure time, whatever it might be.
Maybe can I put a kind of a comment on that question and say maybe is that question really in some sense about the different scales of time, right? There was sort of some of you talked in some of your studies about fine timing in the order of seconds, and then there were weeks and months and years. Does it even make sense to think of that as a common mechanism, or are those really very different things?
Yeah, that's where I was going to go. I do think that it's very much an open question of whether we should think of these as distinct channels at the frequency of seconds and the frequency of decades, or whether they really are tied together in some fundamental way. I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist, and so in a room of neuroscientists, I should probably not say what I'm about to say, but you know, it strikes me that there's a lot of let's call it quasi-modularity in brain function, and the notion that there's a kind of universal mechanism that organizes all of these things sounds unlikely, though of course it is plausible, but unlikely.
Well, I'm just going to defend the notion of a provisional affordance, and agree with the question is profound. I mean, we really don't know what a representation of anything is as it relates to what we experience, right? I mean, that's what we stay up all night arguing about, you know, how your red is like mine or something silly like that, or deep, depending on your point of view. Time, though, as experienced as something that we might do something about, be it with our eyes or our bodies, or in our narrative, or how I might want to deal with my future in David's case, I think then that's the uniting theme. I mean, it's not exactly the same mechanism. A memory retrieval is not the planning of an eye movement to time to the anticipated time of the interval that I showed you. But it's the same basic idea that when the brain is engaged in the possibility of, now let's fill in the blank, that's where our knowledge is. And for people trained in medicine, when you see patients that lack an awareness of things in their world, be it space or object, it's not the representations in the brain, it's the stuff that kind of plans what you might do with it. Again, this notion of a provisional or subjunctive affordance that I like so much. And I think that's the common thread, and that's why I asked Daphna the question about whether memories kind of in some sense are time-stamped with their own horizon. Because that I think allows us to I had the same question going in my mind as I was listening to the other speakers, that allows us, I think, in some ways to navigate, maybe not at the mechanism level, those are going to be all very different, but at the different scales.
Another way to unify the conversation is, at the heart of all of this is causality. And there's lots of ways to understand causality. There's the ability to recognize that I touched this and I got a shock, and there's this proximity between those two events, touch, shock, and there the time interval is very small, and my understanding of that very small time interval is helping me draw a causal inference. And there's other kinds of causality where I'm told, if you do this today, maybe by my human resources advisor, you will retire well in 50 years. And that's a kind of causality that also has this critical temporal dimension, but I'm learning about that causality not through personal experience, but through an external narrative, data that is coming to me from outside. Whether they are a unified mechanism, I don't know, though they're about the same learning of causal channels.
So my question is, I was, the example about the pothole and the person driving caught my attention. And to unify this, I have a question of like, how do you reconcile this notion of anticipatory behavior that you see like at the most basic level, like of neurons, and then also in terms of, like the circadian rhythm with the idea that, like at the aggregate level, of us acting as humans, we may not necessarily anticipate, for that pothole, or we may, is it like, how does that relate to myopia and discounting? Is it just that the time scales are very different, where we may be really good at anticipating things at, a matter of seconds, but then if you ask me today and 2 days from now, I may not be so good at anticipating. What are your thoughts on that?
You said it perfectly. We're causality at high frequency is relatively easy to learn, even without someone lecturing me on the subject. I touch it, I get a shock. I learned it. Even non-human animals pick that up fast. Snails can learn that. Causality at horizons of a decade, very, very hard to learn. In fact, Xavier Gebex, my co-author on that myopia paper, we've been doing some work on thinking about causality even at intermediate horizons, weeks, months. Very, very hard to have a stimulus now and infer the causal consequence at a horizon of an hour or a day or a week. So I think all of these intertemporal decisions that rely on causal representations or causal understandings that go beyond a minute or two take a lot of experience or some kind of external guidance that says, oh, if you read a lot in high school, you'll get a better job. You'd never learn that on your own. Sorry, you wouldn't learn that in high school on your own because you haven't even had the job to get. Only do external voices lead you to that causal insight. And so you're right. We're not so good at low frequency, long horizon causal understanding. Consequently, intertemporal trade-offs at those horizons tend to be imperfect. We're much better at, not touching the hot pan.
We're almost out of time. We're going to take one more question. Mike's been wanting to ask something for a while.
Well, this is actually a follow-up on the question that was just asked, about trying to tie the things together. I mean, all three of you spoke about the capacity of humans and other organisms to locate prospective events, things that are anticipated to happen or should happen at particular points in time. But an interesting difference was that Randy and Mike were both emphasizing how accurately non-human organisms were able to do it, and David was about how even in the case of very conscious human thought, there were systematic errors. And I'm curious, I mean, a suggestion was just made, well, it makes different time scales, but I was wondering, I mean, one of the ideas that David had suggested was that the biases might result from sensation of how distant things were in time being based on comparison with other intervals, as opposed to there being an absolute sense of it. And I was wondering, is that something that even at shorter time intervals shows up in the kind of studies the other two of you were talking about? That there's some reason to think it's not an absolute time difference, but time differences that...
I thought the difference was the disciplines.
Scalar variability shows up everywhere and at every time scale. That is that's why I was so interested in the argument about the Bayesian. But you said the variance was scaled rather than the standard deviation. What?
That's right. You could do it either way.
Okay. Well, because the scale, that is that the uncertainty about intervals is proportional to the interval. As are many physical things. If you buy an electrical resistor, right, you get a 5% resistor or 1% resistor and so on. So depending on how much you're willing to pay. So you see the similar percent uncertainty scaling with interval. And that's an extremely well-established result and holds over certainly from fractions of a second to hours. And it's hard to test on intervals of days because you run into the circadian problem. That is other phenomena, the animal has to sleep and so on, so you run into other problems.
But I think you can have it both ways, because in a sense, the Bayesian timing at the short time scale is a violation of scalar timing. It's accepting a bias in my judgment of time in order to reduce the variability of my production. And in a sense, although it's normative in that case, normative with some known cost function, it might have some at least application, if not at least analogy, to the kinds of problems that you're studying. So I mean, I guess I kind of agree with Daphna. It's just a matter of how we want to frame it. It's mainly consistent with scalar timing that Randy's talking about, but these small violations might have some extension into the world that David studies.
Unfortunately,
Can I make one
final comment?
So
then we're done.
I was struck by the bee data because I thought those bees who had presumably a lot of repetitive training on the relative time of day, it was still the case that the arrivals in the interval just before the first feeding epoch, the ratio was about 3 to 2 going to the right receptacle, which means 40% of the bees were in the wrong location.
No, they didn't. So that's a misinterpretation of the data. And first of all, it's my plot made from this was 1930s. They didn't do fancy graphics, but they didn't record. They weren't able to track the individual bees, and so you have no way of knowing. I talked about it because it makes it more understandable, and because I think it's likely what was going on, that the bee went first here and then there. But in fact, we don't know that from those data because those unlabeled bees.
That's not. I don't mean individual bees. I mean, this was a day where they didn't end up delivering the food at the right time.
Right.
But none of the bees know that 1 minute before in the 15-minute interval before the non-arrival of food at 9 o'clock in the morning.
I take your point. Okay,
so
yes.
At that 15-minute interval before the first feeding epoch,
yes,
I was struck that 40% of the measurements
the other one, yes,
were at location B rather than location A. And so I would flip Mike's question and say, even in this kind of highly stylized environment with repetition and all of this advantage in terms of getting it right, the bees were still, to my surprise, barely getting it right. 40% were in the wrong. 40% of the measurements were in the wrong location.
I'm not siding with anyone on this.
How about me?
Except for the audience. We are out of time. I want to thank the speakers for a wonderful